I will honestly say I don't remember ever speaking a word to Esther the whole time she was there. We were never friends. We never spoke to each other, only on the set.
There are some stories in Hollywood that never quite go away. They linger in the background of every reunion special, every retrospective documentary, every fan forum thread that refuses to die. They survive because people sense there is something real underneath the surface, something that was never fully explained, never properly addressed, and never honestly resolved. The story of Jimmie Walker and Esther Rolle is exactly that kind of story. For nearly 5 decades, audiences who grew up watching Good Times carried a quiet question in the back of their minds. The show gave America one of television's most beloved black families, the Evans family of Chicago's Cabrini Green housing projects. It gave us Florida Evans, the strong, dignified, faith-filled mother played with extraordinary grace by Esther Rolle. And it gave us J.J. Evans, the lanky, joke-cracking oldest son played by Jimmie Walker, whose explosive catchphrase, "Dynamite," turned him into one of the most recognizable faces on American television in the 1970s. Together, they were supposed to be family. On screen, they looked like one. But the moment the cameras stopped rolling, a very different reality took over. Now, at 78 years old, Jimmie Walker has finally said out loud what many fans had long suspected. The silence between him and Esther Rolle was not a misunderstanding. It was not exaggerated gossip or the invention of tabloid writers hungry for drama. It was real. And hearing him confirm it, calmly, without bitterness, and with a kind of perspective that only comes after decades of reflection, changes the way we understand one of the most iconic shows in the history of American television. To understand what happened between Jimmie Walker and Esther Rolle, you first need to understand what Good Times meant when it arrived on CBS in February 1974. This was not just another sitcom. Good Times was a landmark. Created by Eric Monti and Mike Evans, and developed by producer Norman Lear, it was the first American sitcom to feature a two-parent black household living in an inner-city housing project. It tackled poverty, unemployment, racism, and the daily struggles of working-class black life in a way that American television had never attempted before. Esther Rolle came to the show with a clear and deeply personal mission. She had already played the housekeeper Florida Evans on Maude, another Norman Lear production, and she had grown uncomfortable with the limitations of that role. When Good Times was built around her character, Rolle saw it as an opportunity to do something genuinely meaningful, to show black families on television with dignity, complexity, and truth. She was not interested in playing a caricature. She was interested in playing a real woman, a real mother, a real human being whose life reflected the experiences of millions of black Americans who had never seen themselves honestly represented on a mainstream network. John Amos, who played her husband James Evans, brought the same energy and the same convictions. A classically trained actor with a serious commitment to authentic storytelling, Amos believed the show had the power to shift the cultural conversation around black identity in America. Together, Rolle and Amos formed the moral and emotional backbone of Good Times. They were the reason the show carried weight. They were the reason it mattered. And then Jimmie Walker opened his mouth and said, "Dynamite," and everything changed. Nobody predicted what happened with Jimmie Walker. Not the writers, not the producers, not even Walker himself. He was cast as J.J. Evans, the oldest child, a young man who used humor and charm to navigate the harsh realities of life in Cabrini Green. Walker brought something loose and electric to the role, a natural comedic timing that was impossible to manufacture and impossible to ignore. Audiences connected with him instantly. His performance had an energy that leaped off the screen, and the "dynamite" catchphrase spread through American pop culture like wildfire. Within the first 2 seasons, J.J. Evans had become the most talked-about character on the show. Walker's face appeared on lunchboxes, posters, and magazine covers. He was doing late-night television appearances and headlining stand-up tours. For the network, this was a gold mine, and they did what networks always do when they find gold. They started digging deeper and deeper, with less and less concern for what they were disrupting in the process. The writers began building more episodes around JJ's antics. The comedy got broader. The catchphrases multiplied. The character who had started as a struggling young man with real dreams began morphing into something closer to a cartoon, all costume and punchline, with less and less of the human being underneath. This was precisely the transformation that horrified Esther Rolle and John Amos. Rolle spoke about it directly and publicly during the show's run. She was troubled by what JJ had become, a young black man who did not work, could not read or write with competence, and seemed to exist primarily to deliver jokes. She felt the show had started to use JJ as a vehicle for the kind of buffoonery that set back the very representations she had fought to establish. Her concerns were not about Jimmie Walker as a person. They were about what the character of J.J. Evans was communicating to audiences, and specifically what it was communicating to young black viewers about themselves and their possibilities. This distinction matters enormously, and it is one that got lost repeatedly over the years as the story was simplified into a personal feud between two stars. At 78, Jimmie Walker has arrived at the kind of honesty that tends to come when a person no longer has anything to protect. He is not looking for sympathy. He is not trying to rewrite history. He simply seems ready to tell the truth as he experienced it, and the truth he tells is both simpler and more complicated than the rumors suggested. When asked about his relationship with Esther Rolle, Walker did not dance around it. He confirmed plainly that the two of them were never friends. Not in any meaningful sense of the word. They did not spend time together off-set. They did not have conversations that went beyond the requirements of the work. He would not have had her phone number, and she would not have had his. For two people who played mother and son on national television for years, who shared the fictional home of one of America's most beloved TV families, the reality was a near-total absence of personal connection. Walker has been consistent about the fact that this was not the result of a single explosive confrontation. There was no screaming match in a dressing room, no dramatic ultimatum, no moment of irreparable rupture. What there was instead was distance, a quiet, persistent, professional distance that hardened over time into something both parties simply accepted. They were colleagues. They were co-workers. They showed up, delivered their performances, and went their separate ways. What makes Walker's account particularly interesting is what he does not say. He does not express bitterness toward Rolle. He does not characterize her frustrations as irrational or unfair. He seems to understand, from the vantage point of nearly 5 decades later, that the tension on set was rooted in something real and something serious. A genuine disagreement about what Good Times was supposed to be and what responsibility came with the platform the show had been given. The conflict at the heart of Good Times was ultimately a conflict between two legitimate visions. Esther Rolle and John Amos believed they were participating in something historic, a show that had the rare opportunity to humanize black families for a mainstream audience in a way that had never been done before. They took that responsibility seriously, perhaps more seriously than anyone else connected to the production. When they saw the show drifting away from its original purpose, they pushed back. They complained to producers. They spoke to the press. They made their unhappiness known, sometimes in ways that created friction on set and sometimes in ways that made headlines. Jimmie Walker occupied a completely different position. He was a young comedian who had been hired to play a role, and he played it the way the producers and writers asked him to play it. He was not the architect of JJ's evolution into a comedic caricature. He did not sit in writers' rooms demanding more catchphrases and wilder costumes. He was an actor following direction, and the direction he was following happened to be making him famous. To ask him to resist that, to push back against his own rising stardom out of solidarity with a vision he had not personally authored, was perhaps more than could reasonably be expected of anyone. But from Rolle's perspective, Walker's willingness to go along with the transformation, his apparent comfort with the direction things were heading, made him complicit in something she found genuinely damaging. She could distinguish between the actor and the role in theory, but in practice, J.J. Evans walked around with Jimmie Walker's face and Jimmie Walker's voice. The line between them was not always easy to maintain. Norman Lear, reflecting on the situation in later years, acknowledged that the dynamic on set was difficult and that he wished things had unfolded differently. He has suggested that Rolle and Amos might have been more welcoming toward Walker, and that their coldness contributed to a sense of isolation that pushed him further into the protective shell of his comedic persona. Whether that assessment is entirely fair is open to debate. What is not open to debate is that nobody on the production, not the stars, not the producers, not the network, found a way to bridge the divide before it became permanent. The tension that had been simmering beneath the surface of Good Times eventually became impossible to contain. John Amos was let go after the 3rd season. The official explanation was that his persistent conflicts with the writing staff had made him a disruptive presence. His character, James Evans, was killed off in a car accident, an abrupt and jarring end for one of the show's most important figures, and a decision that many viewers never fully forgave. Esther Rolle followed after the 4th season, departing a show she felt had lost its soul. Her exit left Good Times without its two most powerful advocates for serious, dignified storytelling. The show that remained was lighter, faster, and more relentlessly focused on comedy, and for many longtime viewers, it was a fundamentally lesser thing. Rolle returned for the 6th season, having negotiated new terms that included better pay and greater creative input. Among her conditions was a requirement that JJ be written as a more responsible and mature character. But by the time she came back, the damage had been done. The original spirit of Good Times, that particular combination of warmth, humor, and moral seriousness that had made it genuinely groundbreaking, was not something that could be easily reconstructed once it had been allowed to dissipate. The show ended its run in 1979. Jimmie Walker, true to his word, had stayed through all of it. Whatever his private feelings about the changes that had occurred around him, he honored his professional commitments and kept showing up. That consistency deserves acknowledgement, even if it also meant he was the face of a version of Good Times that the show's original architects had fought hard against. Esther Rolle passed away on November 17, 1998, from complications related to diabetes. She was 78 years old. Her funeral was held in Pompano Beach, Florida, where she had grown up, and it drew former cast members, colleagues, and admirers who had been shaped by her work and her example. Jimmie Walker was not there. He was the only major cast member from Good Times who did not attend. His absence was noticed immediately, and it has been talked about ever since. In the years that followed, fans and commentators have offered various interpretations. Some saw it as the final confirmation of a deep and unresolved antagonism. Others speculated that Walker may have felt genuinely unwelcome, that the grief surrounding Rolle's passing would not have been a space where his presence was wanted or appreciated. Others still have suggested that his absence reflected nothing more than the logical conclusion of a relationship that had always been defined by distance, that attending the funeral of someone who was never your friend, in a room full of people who had been far closer to her than you ever were, simply did not feel like the right thing to do. Walker has not offered a detailed public explanation for his absence, and perhaps he does not owe anyone one. But the empty chair at that funeral has become a kind of symbol, a final, wordless statement about two people who shared something enormous in front of millions of viewers and almost nothing at all when the cameras were off.